and then the buyer's agent, the buyer can pay the buyer's agent or
Well,
do a 2-1 buy down or whatever they want to do because
well,
it's
look,
seller to buyer.
yeah, DOJ may object to this position, but right now,
It's all right. They're not on
uh,
this podcast. Go ahead.
uh, I'm willing to consider having the listing agent, um, you know, the seller through the listing agent inform the buyer agent that the seller's prepared to negotiate, or at least discuss this point.
You talk about it privately, we talk about it publicly. This is the Real Estate Insiders Unfiltered Podcast. Welcome again to the Real Estate Insiders Unfiltered Podcast. I'm your host, James Twiggins, along with my co-host, Mr. Keith Robinson, where today we try to get ourselves canceled. So the entire objective was to bring a guest on that would get us canceled. So here we go, Keith. Talk to us about Mr. Steve Brobeck, the CEO of Consumer Federation of America.
Yeah, it was great to have Steve on, honestly, and I don't think we are in any danger of getting canceled. But Steve has been verbose, there's your big word for the day, verbose in his thoughts and the research that he's done and with the Consumer Federation of America. And we got to debate some different points with him, and we agreed on some and disagreed on others. But we talked about the debate of the effect of the lawsuits, commission price fixing or cooperative compensation. We talked agent commission, and we also
his terms,
correct, and licensing standards. So great podcast, good conversation, one that I think James and I both wish more people were having in the industry so that we could push through some of this and just get back to serving the people that we serve.
Put it in yours, kids.
You're going to dig it.
Steve, welcome to the podcast. We are excited to have you here. I'm pretty sure Keith and I will get canceled after this. Partially kidding, but certainly lots of stuff going on in our industry, and you're definitely one of the players in the room that's helping drive some of this stuff. We have a lot of questions for you today, but just to start so that everybody, our viewers and listeners, kind of know who you are, we ask this of every guest. Give us just a little bit of your background, how you got to where you are. And I looked up on LinkedIn because I'm nifty like that you've been with Consumer Federation of America for roughly 44 years, if that's correct.
Longer than that, actually.
Longer than that? Okay.
Eesh.
So you haven't updated your LinkedIn profile. So I blame you and LinkedIn then. All right. So all joking aside, tell us about your background, Consumer Federation of America. We'll dive into all of that and then a lot of the questions we have. So,
Well, James and Keith, I do appreciate this opportunity. I started my professional life as an academic. I taught full-time at Case Western Reserve University during the 1970s, but I wanted to do something that really helped people, not just write academic articles. So while I was teaching, I contacted the Legal Aid Society of Cleveland and worked with them to create a self-help consumer group. That group grew and eventually affiliated with the Consumer Federation of America, CFA, in 1975. And then in 1980, CFA asked me to lead the organization. Now, you want me to briefly describe CFA?
yeah, please, just so people
Okay.
understand the organization, et cetera. Yeah.
CFA is a National Association of Consumer Groups. It just doesn't include advocacy groups. It includes consumer education groups and also a wide variety of consumer co-ops. Um, the work on brokerage, I should add, was never funded by a source with an interest in the issue. People are always asking me that. Now, my interest in real estate brokerage really began in, I think it was 89 or 90, when I came across the FTC's 1983 report on the industry. I waded through that. I talked to the authors of that report, and I realized that nobody in the consumer movement was addressing the concerns that that report raised. So I began research and writing reports focusing on two big issues. The first was subagency. At that time, it was really central to the industry, but buyers had no representation. Buyer agents were put in a very difficult, compromising situation. I wrote reports. I helped convince Ken Harney to write articles that were widely syndicated in newspapers about that issue. And shortly after that, NAR abandoned their support for sub-agency, left things up to the states. We now have 51 different agency laws. There are issues there that still need to be addressed. I wrote a report 6 or 7 years ago called it the agency mess. Still, the mess is better than buyers having no representation whatsoever.
Right, right.
The second issue was high uniform rates. I wrote several initial reports based on a lot of research, got a lot of press coverage, but there really wasn't any effect. In 2006, I did testify before Congress on brokerage issues, and that testimony and my written comments to the 2018 FTC DOJ workshop were cited frequently in the moral pleading.
Mm-hmm.
Then, when I retired as head of CFA in 2018, continued working on brokerage issues on a pro bono basis. Without any administrative responsibilities, I could devote more time to the issue. And so since 2018, I think if you look at the CFA website, issues under housing, under real estate brokerage, you'll see about 20 reports I've written since that time.
Got it. Well, it's funny because, well, so first of all, I just want to say thank you for being here because Keith and I are of the opinion that it's important for everybody to hear sort of all sides of what's going on in the business because as we will talk about, there are probably going to be things Keith and I don't agree with today. And there are things we do agree with. You mentioned sub-agency. Yep. We hate it. We absolutely believe it should go away. And in most states, it already has, obviously, or it's not being used anymore. But so you've been involved in this consumer side. We'll get to some of these questions. Just give me the general premise for Consumer Federation of America. Its main driver is to do what? Just cement that for us real quick.
To advance the interests of consumers through advocacy, education, and research.
Okay.
It is not an anti-industry group in any way, shape, or form. We are simply trying to help consumers.
And do you, just to piggyback on that, you write research papers, and I'm assuming that I shouldn't assume anything. I should ask the question. Are you involved in you said testifying, or do you work with the Federal Trade Commission on occasion or the Department of Justice? Like, what is the CFA's position with being involved in moving industries or litigation, et cetera? Because I think there's a lot of people that want to know that question.
Well, CFA does not litigate.
I meant as far as working with.
Litigators do use our research, but we don't litigate. Now, in terms of our relation, we communicate with agencies, but they don't tell us what they're going to do. We send things to DOJ, for example. We have had conversations, but they never disclose anything about what they're going to do or their positions. We have those meetings because they want to listen to what I have to say. They have meetings, as you know, with the industry, and they take the same position to industry.
Got it.
So really, it's the research arm that has. Yeah. They take your research and will ask you questions about your research more.
That's really it. I mean, to the extent that I add any value to the consumer movement, 90% of it is the research and reports. And the fact is, since there aren't many consumer advocates who understand very much about real estate brokerage issues, I end up being a spokesperson too. That's not my favorite role. My favorite role is doing research and producing reports.
Let me ask you this before we get to some of our main questions. Over your career, did you ever used to work with the National Association of Realtors or brokerage industry, or like collaboratively with them on these issues? Was there a relationship there?
Early on, many times. In fact, on sub-agency, well, the interesting thing is Bill North, you know who I'm talking about. He was the general counsel of NAR back in the 80s and early 90s. And he really was largely responsible for designing the sub-agency system. And I remember before Ken Harney wrote those articles, he called me up, invited me out to lunch, and explained how that the system, if it were abandoned, would lead to a big mess. And I agreed with him, but I said the mess was better than the current situation. But we were conversing at that point. After the industry essentially abandoned sub-agency, I I've always had talks, especially back then with top officials of NAR. And I remember after that, we agreed that uh, agents should be required to do early disclosures of their agency. And we had a press conference that the president of NAR and I announced that support for that requirement, which a number of states followed up on. And we advanced specific principles that ought to be part of that. So, and I have always, by the way, starting back over 30 years ago, offered to let the industry, and specifically MAR, see my reports in draft form and comment on them. And they did that pretty much up until about 5 or 6 years ago. I won't give them the reports if they won't comment on them. But if they're going to comment on them, I will give them all my reports in draft form because I really think I'm concerned that the reports are accurate. And I think that the industry would benefit from reviewing my reports when they're in draft form.
Do you think is there a reason that they stopped reviewing and providing comments? Do you think?
Well, I don't know. You ought
Yeah,
to talk to them. My guess is
it's fair.
that I think if they give me comments, I can then say, well, they gave me comments. I'm not into playing those games.
Sure.
I'm trying to do the right thing here.
Yeah,
I don't always get right, but I am trying.
So let's
for
go to
sure.
one of the main subjects we want to talk about today. You've been obviously very vocal about cooperative compensation, um, and that it needs to, I'm going to put the words in your mouth, but essentially it needs to go away. Is that fair?
Well, what the industry calls cooperative compensation is thought by many of us to be price fixing, or more precisely, the facilitation of high, nearly uniform rates. Uh, Buyer agent commissions really effectively can't be or couldn't have been negotiated. And most listing agents, according to our research, won't negotiate the listing agent commissions. So, that's pretty much a price fixed system. Now, there's much talk about steering. It's actually hard to find because the industry is so successful at discouraging price competition. So it's effectively the threat of steering that helps keep the industry in line. We've thought of mandatory agent commission offers as the linchpin of collusive price setting, but more importantly than that, it's really a century of industry practice that's created a very powerful culture supporting the lack of price competition. One of the many examples of the lack of competition is the refusal of industry groups, except a few discounters, to advertise prices or even discuss them on websites. I mean, this is very unusual for a retail industry. Back in 1990, brokers would tell you the normal fee they charge. We know because we called 500 of them, but today they won't. So if the marketplace were normal, buyers and sellers would each negotiate agent compensation and pay for it separately, and companies and brokers would compete on the basis of price as well as service.
When you say pay for it separately, is the idea that you want a buyer to pay their buyer's agent and a seller to pay their seller's agent, like just complete
Well,
separation from that? Just because
well,
you said that, so I want to make sure I'm understanding your
yeah.
point.
Well, first, it's a little complicated. I mean, first of all, the reason the main reason I believe the jury made their decision, which was so quick and involved such a large award, is because they just didn't think it was fair that sellers should be required to compensate buyer agents. That was I think the central reason they made that decision. And I think the industry knows that if there are other jury trials, the juries will render the same decision. But we do understand that there is a challenge right now because the buyer agent commissions, according to economists and most experts, are built into the sale price. And that makes things very, 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 very complicated. So, we're prepared at this point to accept the position that buyers can request assistance, financial assistance from sellers to help them compensate their agents. But really, the key thing is that the sellers and the buyers need to do that negotiation. It should not be manipulated by agents. And that's what some agents are trying to do right now.
Yeah, there's a lot of workarounds that are going on for sure. I want to I want to just pin in on this for a second because so this idea of price fixing, what were the two reports you guys that were used in the trial? I think one was from Redfin, if I remember correctly, and then a report from a while ago on
Well, there
standard.
was a lot. They used quite a few of our reports in the trial, and I'm not even sure because I haven't even read all the transcripts.
Hmm.
But the initial moral pleading, moral's really the first big lawsuit,
Hmm.
and they drew very heavily from that 2006 testimony and the 2018 comments to the FTC and DOJ.
Hmm.
Um, but I know the plaintiff's attorneys, lots of people call me up to ask me about the reports,
Yeah.
and they have the plaintiff's attorneys, not just those, but other reports, the Florida report, the New York City report, and I respond to their questions as best I can as a researcher.
What was interesting about, so I read some of this stuff, and Steve, I'm pretty educated on these things. Done a lot of research on it. What was interesting to me is even in our own organization, I went and looked at commission rates across 600 offices at closing, to be clear, HUD statement, different than what was advertised in advance. And it was interesting to me to watch because those numbers ranged all over the place, like all over the gamut. And I actually, ironically, what I realized was the numbers were a lot lower than I thought they would be. It's a whole other conversation, but um, I don't think Keith and I disagree with you on that. There should be an understanding. Keith, I'll let you speak for yourself, but I definitely think the idea of a seller agreeing to what the seller's agent's going to charge and a buyer agreeing to what a buyer's agent's going to charge is a good model. I do. I think
Hmm.
I think it does make sense long term. I worry from what I'm reading from some of the plaintiffs' lawyers and stuff they're posting about this idea that it needs to be the buyer paying the buyer's agent, and that the seller shouldn't be. I've heard words of bribery
Allowed.
used or
Yeah.
loud,
Yeah.
and I'm just going, well, how the hell are they supposed to do that
Mhm.
when we have a system that doesn't allow it? A and B, the cost of housing is so high. How do we create an opportunity for people to get into home ownership, which I think the three of us could agree is the largest generational generator of wealth, without a mechanism to do so?
Well, I think there's a simple mechanism. Well, in theory, there's a simple mechanism. In reality, it's very difficult to get there. But basically, buyers should be allowed to easily include the buyer agent commission in their financing. Now, the complexity there is, as I mentioned earlier, it's already built into the sale price. So, it's somewhat complicated. But if there were a commitment from the industry to do that, to truly uncouple the rates. And the industry's too powerful, to allow that to happen, in my view. It would get done just as when there was a problem with the VA, the sales, the industry just asked for relief and very quickly, federal agency gave them that relief and solved that problem. So, we can talk about that's the real solution. And there needs to be discussion about that solution. But to date, the industry will simply make arguments against it. They will not sit down and talk about that. We have a group of people who've even met with the White House on the issue. And what we hear is that the agencies right now just don't want to spend the time on that. And I think one reason why is they know that the industry will say we oppose that. Why will the industry oppose that? Because complete uncoupling, and with exceptions, we're looking at a sub-agency kind of system here, where a situation here where sub-agency still sometimes used, but generally speaking, it is not.
Yeah.
That if there were a complete separation of a solution to this, both sellers and buyers would be effectively able to negotiate the commissions. Consumer costs would come down. The problem now is that what's going to happen, I'm afraid, is that the agents are going to basically tell their clients that this is the way things will continue to tell their clients that this is the way things are done. And if you want a seller to accept an offer, you know, the buyer's got to ask for the money. The seller will be told by the listing agent that, if you want to sell your home, you've got to agree to this. And we can see even with some agencies that they're requiring that. They won't. We're seeing examples of buyer agents not agreeing to show a home if the listing agent does not agree to provide a very fixed commission percentage.
I've seen it. We've
Yep.
seen it already.
We
Yeah.
have.
Which is a complete violation of their duty, to be clear. Anybody
Yeah.
who listens to this has a problem with it, get out of the industry.
Yeah, we've been pretty vocal
Yeah.
on I agree with you that is happening. I don't think it's obviously not unilateral, right? That I don't even know that most of the industry is approaching it that way. But some of the industry is approaching it that way. And
It's also going to take time to get everybody to figure this out. I mean,
correct.
there's a little bit of
Correct.
time that has to work into it. But I guess my question is, you made this comment that the fees will come down, or the price of the home will, did you say the price of the home will come down? Is that what you were alluding to?
Well, if you take, I mean, I think just obviously, and this is isolating this one factor, if you take the buyer agent commission out of the sale price, the home sale price will come down. Now, but really what we should be focusing on is consumer costs. So
Right.
the idea is to make that buyer agent commission explicit and negotiable by buyer, and have the sellers also make a greater effort to negotiate down the commission, and then costs will decline, and we will have a more price competitive marketplace.
The, the I guess my question is, I agree with you that if we had the power to wave our magic wands and allow the commission to be easily financed, that would be a very elegant solution that would create fluidity in the marketplace and dynamic negotiations and all of those components. The problem is that's hard, but the reason that it's hard is it's in my opinion, it's more of a political thing than there has to be political will, because it's Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. It's not NAR or the real estate industry that is in charge of that. You need Fannie and Freddie to get on board, because that's the secondary mortgage market that banks have to sell into to do it at scale, right? And until there's a real problem and people start making a bunch of noise, I don't know that there'll be the political will to try to push that through Fannie and Freddie, versus it's more of a financial services industry issue than a residential real estate / NAR issue, right?
Yeah, Keith, I agree entirely with you. What I think is going to happen, and by the way, James, I agree and have been saying that things are not going to, from a consumer's perspective, appear to change very much in the near future. And we can talk about, at some point, what I think is going to be happening over the next several years. But one of the things I think will happen is that the industry will increasingly warm to the idea of the buyer financing of agent commissions for two reasons. The first is because of the contracts. The contracts are going to scare a lot of consumers, and they're going to end up calling the listing agent. Hopefully, with the assistance of an attorney, many won't. We can discuss dual agency if you want to, but nevertheless,
don't get me on that soapbox.
I'm not talking about preferences here. I'm talking about what's going to happen, what I think is going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not only because they think they may be obligated to pay for the buyer agent compensation themselves, but it's also because they don't understand the contracts. And I suspect we'll be talking about the contracts later on in this conversation. The the other thing that's going to happen is that sellers increasingly will be unwilling to provide full or partial compensation to the buyer agents. And those two things, I think.
Why do you think that would? I'm just curious the underlying thinking behind that.
Well, what the first industry survey I saw on that, I saw over 20% of sellers saying they weren't going to make that offer. Now, who knows what's exactly
Right. Yeah.
happened, but
Yeah.
the fact is, again, you have to think back to that jury decision that I think and I may do this, I may do a survey, objective survey to find out how consumers really think about this, like, working with a national survey firm. But I think that if that question were put to most Americans, they would say that's really not fair to require or strongly expect a seller to compensate not only their own agent, but also the buyer's agent.
But a seller is really focused on their optimal outcome, right? What I mean by that is a seller's focused on their net. What will net me more?
Right. Well,
And if by offering compensation or being willing to pay compensation, that widens the buyer pool and can put upward pressure on what I would receive in offers as far as price. If the net is more, then I think a seller would be more than happy to cover the cost of both. But if the net was less, then obviously they wouldn't. Do
well,
you agree
the
with that?
problem
Or
is that some brokers are now asking uh, sellers to specify a specific percentage, or they won't deal with them.
yeah,
And
that's wrong. And
we're
we've
suggesting
yeah.
is that what we're suggesting is that sellers indicate a willingness to discuss this issue.
Yes.
And then buyers and sellers, really not their agents, they have to be the intermediaries, need to discuss the price of the house and the commission together. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
These
Yes.
are the two really negotiable parts,
Mm-hmm.
uh, variable parts of the buyer cost. And I think that will increasingly happen. I think that's probably what's going to happen with your agents, James.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, so just an interesting comment. We had Gary Acosta on the podcast, and he has some interesting comments that he made, as you can imagine. But uh, he made a comment, I just didn't even think about it, that sellers are, to the survey point, sellers are forgetting that they can save money on not offering compensation to the buyer's agent, but that also means considering 80% of sellers buy, that on the other side of it, they're paying their own money as well. Meaning it kind of goes in this loop in the current system, which I'm not advocating for one way or the other, to be clear. I'm just saying that in the current system, you're paying it, but then when you buy a house, it's coming back around the same way. Now we're separating all of that out. I get that. And I'm not arguing that basis, but I think that some of the survey responses we're getting is like, well, hell, I don't want to do any of that, until they realize they actually have to pay their own agent on the other side. That survey
Well,
response might be different, is my point.
well,
So,
we'll see, because what are we? Are we still up at 40% of sales are in cash? I mean, we'll just see. I mean,
yeah, we don't know, and I think it's a fair comment. We all agree that this is gonna look different. I want to just make sure I'm getting this before we move on to this next conversation. Of your view, if I got this right, is that it is a seller can, for example, a seller can offer a buyer a concession, and then it's between the two of them, and then the buyer's agent, the buyer can pay the buyer's agent or
well,
do a 2-1 buy down or whatever they want to do, because it's
look,
seller to buyer.
yeah, DOJ may object to this position, but right now,
It's all right. They're not on
um,
this podcast. Go ahead.
well, I'm willing to consider having the listing agent, um, you know, the seller through the listing agent, inform the buyer agent that the seller's prepared to negotiate, or at least discuss this point.
Mm-hmm.
Huh?
But then it's got to be, the buyer has to be involved. See,
Yeah.
Yeah.
what's going to happen now is that if
Meaning no more cooperative compensation. I want
if
to.
right,
Yeah.
if you continue the existing system, there really isn't an incentive for buyers to do a negotiation, and this is what's going to happen. I can just see this
Mm-hmm.
with, many agents are going to tell their buyers, look, when the buyer wants to negotiate the commission, oh, don't worry about that. We're going to get that from the seller. I mean, that's what they've always said. That's what they will continue to say. And that's what most buyers will not understand what's going on well enough to, actually then try to negotiate the commission and understand that the lower that commission that they negotiate, the easier it will be to negotiate sale price with the seller.
Just to be clear, are you opposed to sitting down with a buyer and saying, we have this buyer rep agreement? Well, I'm not going to get too detailed on the terms. Let's just say it's not exclusive just for conversation's sake, but this is what I get. This is my fee. And we have multiple ways that this can be paid. You can pay it. We can put it in the offer. If you can't afford to pay my fee, we can ask that the seller pay the fee through the closing. And the third option is we can ask the seller for a concession that goes to you, and then you can obviously use that concession to pay closing costs. Are you opposed to that?
Or some combination
or
of
some
all three?
Combination of that three,
No,
whatever.
no, some combination of that. No, it can be built into the offer, and
Okay.
then hopefully there will be a negotiation between the seller and the buyer about that.
Yeah. But you mentioned this comment
and sale price.
The DOJ may differ. What do you mean by that? You said the DOJ might have a different opinion.
I don't know. DOJ really has not, I think, directly addressed that question. We may learn if they issue a statement on this.
Well, what's interesting is I've asked this question. I think the DOJ, if it tries to interfere with a seller, to be clear, removing cooperative compensation, just want to be clear with the statement we're talking about, restricting a seller from deciding what they want to do. I mean, I've talked to lawyers who go, that's restraint of trade. You literally cannot restrict a seller from doing what it wants with a buyer. Like, that's literally how the foundation of capitalism works in the United States. Am I off? Meaning, you as a seller can, if you want to incentivize somebody on eBay to buy your home or your car.
If DOJ has that opinion, I'd like to hear, the basis for that opinion. They have lots of lawyers who know lots more about contracts than I do. And I'm not going to get in the middle of that one right now.
I get it. I'm pushing you a little bit. I think the system, I guess my comment would be this: the system of where we're moving to, which is listing agent agrees to its term. And to be clear, so everybody hears this, Keith and I are not in favor of cooperative compensation. To be clear, we are not. It's done. It's over. There's no reason to. There's just no reason to, especially if what you said is not an issue with the DOJ. And honestly, if they did have an issue with it, I think we should fight it. But as long as the buyer is instructing the buyer's agent to put that request in the offer, and the seller is agreeing to doing that without cooperative compensation, I personally think that's every American's right to make that choice. And it's also not propping up compensation because there's no collecting of money and remitting it between brokerages anymore. It's just, this is what I get paid to represent you. This is my fee to represent you. How all that comes together is between the buyer and the seller, to your point. Am I wrong? Or
as long as the agents don't collude among themselves to manipulate that, and that's a big, big issue.
And let me ask you this, since we're on this, is a listing agent sitting down and having a conversation with a seller, and they say, I'm going to give you the way that, at least I'm going to throw this out here, we're teaching our people. I hope they got them right now. This putting this out there, but is that, look, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, here's the deal. We want to get as many offers in as possible for your property. We're advising our people that you don't need to offer any type of compensation in advance of an offer. We're telling them you can simply state the seller is willing to entertain any and all requests. Put it in your offer. Let the offer come in. We can see what those are. The listing agent can meet with the seller, do a side-by-side to Keith's comment, which he's accurate with, compare the net and go, this is what the best scenarios. We could counter all of those, whatever it might be. But to me, that process of, we're just saying we're open to anything. We're not telling you what we're going to do. We're not playing our hand. And the buyer's agent just needs to know that every house that's on the market should A, be shown.
Yeah.
And B, you can request whatever the hell you want in an offer. It could be the refrigerator, the carpet, the couch, doesn't matter what it is. It's a negotiation then between the two parties. Am I off on that scripting?
Yeah, I think this is the best option you have available to you given the current marketplace. Again, the real solution is to allow the buyer financing of the commission.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, let's go to the settlement. Thoughts on what was great and not from your perspective, which is where we're probably going to disagree. um,
I would, I would first note that the mandatory buyer contracts were actually not part of the settlement. I actually suggested that it was at one point, and I got a communication from one of the plaintiff's attorneys saying I was dead wrong, and they were right. It's a separate initiative from the industry, and I'm sure we'll discuss this later. But the settlement really is a partial uncoupling of listing agent and buyer agent rates. That's the source of much confusion, ambiguity, dispute, and attempts by some industry members to effectively preserve the old system, the partial, not the complete uncoupling of the commissions. DOJ and consumer groups would like the buyers and sellers to first negotiate their agent's comp, then have the buyers and sellers negotiate any seller contribution with each other. Okay, that's a good sort of general position, but working out the details on that is really what
well,
we've
we're
been
kind of there, aren't we?
not easy. Yeah. The and again, the real solution is to let buyers finance the buyer agent commissions. The industry won't even discuss this with us
Well, that just to be clear, Steve,
seriously.
that is a conversation the industry is having. I mean, I can tell you behind, I'm having those conversations quite often about how we make that mechanism work. I just to put a pin on this, I think if that's common ground where CFA, DOJ, and God forbid the plaintiff's lawyers want to do something proactive too, we could probably all come together on figuring out how to make that work.
Yeah, well, I can see I see and talk to a number of industry members who are suggesting that this is the solution that
Mm-hmm.
would eliminate confusion, ambiguity, disagreements,
I think
fighting, all of that. I mean, look, I mean, from a common sense point of view, shouldn't the seller compensate his or her agent, and shouldn't the buyer compensate his or her agent? We have a convoluted system here. In my testimony in 2006, I thought I was nice. I called it the cockamamie, a cockamamie system that we have to basically turn into a more sensible, rational system. But it's not easy to do that because
Yeah.
it's so complicated.
Well, I will agree with you as long as there was a mechanism that makes sense. The
yeah.
question is how we get to that mechanism so
And
that
what do we do between here? I think
between
we all
them.
agree that the ability to finance it would be great. I think the likelihood of that happening with speed is near zero, right? And
I agree. I mean,
so
I'd like to
what
see
do
it a little more. I
we got to
mean, are you having these conversations with NAR
yeah.
and with some of the
I
recalcitrant?
can actually tell you that those are conversations that are happening. They are happening with Fannie and Freddie. And
That's
the
good.
answers I've gotten from candidly Shannon McGann, the chief, advocacy officer for NAR, is that unless it is urgent for Congress, meaning something that's going to get them elected and gets them on the news, because that's all Congress people do, is it won't be a priority. The only reason why the veteran thing was taken care of was because it was, Americans
Made
pick
it a
and choose,
priority.
but it
Yeah.
made it a priority. And the unfortunate answer I've gotten, and by the way, I've spoken to not just Shannon McGann, but I've talked to people like on the Hill, is until it's in the news and it's like, oh, look, minorities and low income Americans are getting screwed and it becomes a hot button issue, nobody does anything, which we all know that's how Congress works. So the question is, how do we get a loud enough microphone?
Well, and currently the microphone is pointed in the wrong and other direction, right? This is being politically communicated as a win for the buyer, which it may or may not be, but without the ability to finance it, it made it harder for the buyer in many
Yes, no
instances,
question
right?
about that. No question
So
about that.
we're not only like we need it's not pointed in the right direction. It's actually pointed, the political will is pointed in the wrong direction. So we have to get 180 degrees
Yeah,
different.
like the plaintiff's lawyers should take some of the money they're getting and actually put it towards advocacy for like helping first-time home. I'm not joking when I say that. Like put a
Yeah,
program
yeah,
together
you
to help
are.
people.
They're
Not.
not
I'm actually
gonna
being
do that.
serious.
They
Like
will never do that.
I know, but there isn't a conceited effort to solve this issue. Stephen, I can tell you're genuine about the fact that
Yeah.
you want to make sure that's solved as well. Like we all agree on this part. The question is,
What do we do between now and
how
then?
do we do between now and then? Yeah.
Well, see, I think we need to find the simplest possible mechanism. This is not my idea. It was actually an idea that came from the industry. We simply expand that 6% concession on the FHA loans to 8%. Yeah, there you go, 2% additional. They can be used to finance. Now, and
Yes.
other mechanisms, that people who know more about this issue than I do could come up. I tell you, I talk to NAR, and they're just simply unwilling to discuss this issue seriously, and they're focusing all their attention on me. There are other people, who think this is the sensible solution and think that this could be worked out. And so I do really, again, in part because I believe there's going to be increasing pressure from in the industry for the leadership to consider this issue for reasons that I've already
Mm-hmm.
suggested.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just going to sit and wait and hope that we make the best of the current situation. There are not going to be any radical changes. There will be some improvements. I've even told NAR, look, I mean, for all kinds of reasons, it is not easy to introduce real price competition into this industry. And I've told NAR, we have a system here with maybe 5 to 10% price competition. There is erosion around the edges. There is some variation. You do know, both of you, that I did research on rates, offered rates in 35 different cities, and I found some variation, and I revealed all that.
Mm-hmm.
But we're just going to have to wait, I believe, on most of the leaders. The industry is having many arguments right now. They're going to have to resolve these arguments and
Yeah.
come around, at least
No
the
way.
Yeah.
majority, to
James and I are in.
that. Look, let's seriously explore this and talk to not just ourselves and to the agencies, but to talk to consumer representatives, as
And
well.
finding a
I don't
path.
know that the
Yeah.
plaintiffs' attorneys are going to continue to join these conversations unless the industry simply refuses to accept the settlement, and then there'll be more litigation.
Lawsuits,
Hopefully
right?
not.
Yeah. Let's
Yeah.
talk about that while we're going for time's sake. Cooperative compensation was in the MLS. Now it's been moved to forms. Douglas Miller came out pretty aggressively. For those of you who don't know who he is, he's somebody who was involved in the Morel case. That's basically a committee of competing brokers creating a standardized
Form.
forms with commission sharing in them. Is basically the next. This I'm using his
It's
words,
just
by the way.
collusion of a different color, right?
He literally
That's
came out and said it's the next antitrust case in his article yesterday. So, what's your take on that?
Well, I haven't read and thought about that seriously enough. I mean, we've written a lot about the contracts, and I'm prepared to discuss what we've written about the
Yeah,
contract.
go ahead.
sure.
Yeah, but do
Yeah,
okay.
you can talk about I mean, I want to know for look, talk about the contracts, but I also want to. I'm trying to understand if where the industry is moving is potentially more litigation. I want to get your take on that. So whatever order you want to go in.
Well,
So
I got to tell you, you're talking to the wrong guy. I'm not a lawyer. As I said, I don't talk to plaintiffs' lawyers very
mm,
often. And when we do, they're asking for clarifications of my research anyway. So, in theory, the agreements could be very good for consumers if they were readable, if they were fair, and they were signed at the appropriate time. But none of these criteria are met by most contracts right now. Most aren't easily readable or understandable. I mean, we've been working with a law professor who teaches contracts, and she said that she can't even understand some of these contracts. Most contain anti-consumer provisions such as mandatory arbitration, pre-approval of dual agency, and some blatantly perpetuate price fixing. Those that combine buyer agent commission and listing agent commission don't separate the two, or those that require buyer agent compensation.
There's your answer.
So finally, the timing's all wrong. Again, because the industry did what they wanted to do, and I think didn't consult consumers.
Well, I wouldn't. I respect what you said, and I agree with most of what you said until you got to the industry, because there are
Okay.
there are some states who are excluding that, and there are some states who are not. So
Okay. Well,
just
point taken. Point
all
taken.
right, fair.
And anyway,
But I do understand your point and
but
agree
look,
with it.
the general understanding is that, or a position is that the contracts have to be signed before the showing, the first showing.
Correct.
What should have happened, and in fact, this point was even made by an industry leader who I talked to about this a half a year ago. There ought to be an early disclosure of the contract, and a discussion. That's at the early stage. Then there should be showing nothing signed, and that contract should not be required to be signed until the first offer. That's sort of what makes sense.
That's how a lot of
It's fair
states
to
do
the
it.
industry, and I think it's fair to consumers. Instead, the industry has created, or at least part of some of the industry, to take your point,
Yeah.
uh, just a mess here. Consumers don't understand touring agreements. I mean, I talked to report touring agreements. What's a touring agreement? Well, the reporters are getting up to speed. So you may be talking about 2 contracts, 3 contracts. Well, I mean, it's just a mess. So the key thing is to move back the timing there from the first showing to the first offer.
I don't think, by the way, most agents would
Most
disagree with
agents
you
would
on
love
that.
that. Yeah.
And by the way, I think if I'm wrong here, Keith, I'm close. But let's just go with 16 states across the U.S., some number around there.
Yeah.
Already had mandatory buyer rep agreements. And to your point, it was at the first offer. And so that for a lot of those agents who have been working underneath, like North Carolina, a bunch of others, but that's been a standard process. The new change for them is at the first point of contact. And I'll argue that's not exactly fun for the agent either.
Well, yeah,
Like,
I mean that's a byproduct. Look, that's a direct byproduct of the lawsuit. If you're trying to sue for steering and you don't make someone sign that until the offer experience, well, the steering has already happened, right?
Right.
So if that
That's a good
is
point.
how people were harmed, you have to do it earlier. I think it's more a byproduct of the lawsuit.
That's a good point.
Look,
Mhm.
you're raising big questions about the whole existing compensation system, which in many respects I don't think makes a lot of sense. Right now, buyers and sellers, and I'm a little sympathetic to this, have to wait until, well, in most cases, the property is sold to receive any compensation at all. So you lead to crazy situations where, for example, a buyer agent re receives the same compensation for if they show 1 house or 12 houses. They receive no compensation if they show 12 houses and there's no sale.
Right.
I mean, there's no relationship here between price and service, effectively, or very little relationship. And so we need to be asking questions about the compensation system. I think I talk about, my prediction is that the rates eventually will come down from 5 to 6% to 3 to 4%, with a lot of variation in rates. That really the real pros, the brokers with the good reputations who are very competent are going to be able to charge more than the newbies like me. I spent 3 weeks and got my real estate sales license in DC last summer to sort of
Congratulations.
learn what that's all about.
You're now part of the industry. Welcome.
You would be a fool to pay me 3 cents, 3%.
And we need to talk about what you're doing during retirement, because you got
Yeah.
it all backwards.
You need some new
We're
hobbies.
supposed to leave
Steve.
real estate, not come into real estate.
Well, it's a little late for that, but
yeah.
But let me just say on the contracts thing, there are some good contracts out there. I mean, we're both aware that EXP, and I had nothing to do with that. DOJ had nothing to do with that. Has prepared really simple, readable contracts that are fundamentally fair to both sellers and buyers, they have also offered the use of those contracts to any broker or company. And that's really where we ought to start the conversation.
Yeah. Shout out to Leo, by the way.
Not with the first drafts of the California Association of Commissions,
we have Leo that's going to be a guest on the show momentarily to talk about that. So I agree with you. I'll tell you another thing to think about though is, I mean, associations are creating all these forms that are just a disaster. And so all these brokerages are going out and creating their own. Now, from one side of it, it removes any type of collusion claim because brokers aren't using shared forms. But at the same time, I think we can all agree they're going to be a mess because everyone's just going to be all over the place. So,
well, use the EXP form, Notorious Rob, recommend that to your industry. And others have as well. I mean, this is what, if brokers want to simplify this, treat consumers well, and earn the respect of consumers, they should use that kind of form.
All right.
Yep, I agree. I do. I think a simple form process and clear communication is good.
The Northwest MLS done this too, or the state of Washington's got a really good buyer rep form. It's 3 pages, simple to understand, very clean. Everybody uses a standardized form across that. Do you think it'll become a state thing where the states come in and require their own forms like a lot of other states have?
Yeah, I think that will increasingly happen, but I have mixed feelings about that because if the states are really paying attention and do this independently, they'll end up probably with pretty good forms. But you know that the industry has a huge amount of influence at the state level. And I'm afraid that, bad forms, the industry will persuade legislators or
at the state level, you mean?
At the state level to adopt bad forms. So, it's complicated, politics involved.
I want to ask you this, and this is a point of contention for me. And you wrote an op-ed about like shooting for a commission rate of 2%. Where did that come from? Well, what was the idea of trying to tell everybody to use shoot for one standard rate?
This is just advice, and it's really based on the fact that consumers don't understand commissions very well. And if you ask them to negotiate commissions, they're sort of, what, and they want more specific advice. The commissions now tend to be 2.5% to 3%. And, but in some areas, they're actually as low for buyer agents as 2%, but the listing agents are collecting more, which is probably not fair, but that's another topic to discuss. So, 2% plus 2% is 4%. And 4% isn't that far from 5%. It's only 1.2% in UK, and yes, the system's different, but that is a huge, gap in an agent compensation. They're 1.2 to 5%, say.
But I do respect what you're saying, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but they are very different systems. Like you can't.
Of course, and I always say that, and I've never recommended adopting the British system ever.
Yeah. Okay.
I just point that out to show that you're talking about 60 to $70 billion in commissions there. In the US, the difference between 1.2% and say 5.5%. Now, another important factor is that New York City has a little bit different situation because of this renegade MLS, the Brooklyn MLS. And as a result of their activity, the rates outside of the REBNY areas, which is mainly Manhattan and the higher income areas in Brooklyn, average 3 to 4% right now. So, so it can be done. I don't hear complaints about that. I did a big study on New York City commissions and everybody I talked to, nobody was complaining about that. So I do think that this is a good target. You need a specific target. Look, when
But I mean, can't we pick 6 as the target instead of 2 plus 2? Can't we do 3 plus 3?
I'm just saying.
I'm just messing with you.
You can pick 8. Look,
yeah, there we go. See, we do agree. I knew we'd get there.
CFA
I'm just kidding.
Recommending 4 and 2 right
Yeah.
now, with maybe a 3 for a double ending. I mean, look, we recognize that there are different situations,
Sure.
but the existing compensation system does not recognize any kind of variation in differences between agents or in the amount of work on a particular
I
sale.
mean, but
So,
there has been
so
there always has been choice though. Like I think sometimes people forget that. Redfin's been around a long time.
Mm-hmm.
That's not a new business. Help You Sell was developed in 1976.
wait a second, James. Look, they were driven to their current compromise. I mean, they were offering 3% rates initially, and then they couldn't get buyers to
Hold on.
cooperate with them.
Hold on. What I was getting at was, but people. So you're trying to just be clear your comment. You're trying to say that the industry forced them not to be able to work. Is that
No,
what you're
no. Well,
saying?
look, it's a cooperative industry, and when Redfin started, they had great ideas, and they could not get cooperation from the buyer agents. So that's why they had to essentially compromise and offer the going rate. I mean,
Well,
that's
actually, in fairness, because I've had conversations with Glenn on this very topic. One of the issues they had was they couldn't get very high producing agents because they couldn't compensate them enough.
well.
I mean, literally had this as we had him on a pod and we talked about this very
Yeah,
subject.
well,
I'm
now
not, it
you're
doesn't,
raising, okay, James, you've just raised the white elephant and that issue, and that's the fact that there's a huge glut of agents that makes it practically impossible for
no
most
argument.
agents to
Yeah.
No
earn a
argument
living
here.
income. And we
Yeah.
ought to discuss that because I think that's at the root of so many problems and frustrations that both the industry and consumers, have right now.
My
But
comment was related to the fact that people want to be able to make whatever living they want and charge what rates they want
yeah,
to, and people are willing to accept that. Then they get to do that. One point I want to put on here that I think is important, and then we'll talk about that, and then we'll wrap up just for time's sake. There's a comment here that I think is important people to remember, and I've had these conversations with errors and emissions companies, so you know where this is coming from. When we talk about rates, and this will tie into the agent, quality part, but when we talk about rates, the idea of having people get not as good representation because it's cheaper or no representation at all. And this came directly from, I'm not going to name the insurance company, but they go, the cost of litigation for having these deals go south and paying lawyers more money than they deserve is so much significantly higher than working with somebody who's in the profession, has E&O coverage, like all of these different pieces, that I worry that just trying to make it all about price will end up creating a worse situation for the seller and or buyer. And just for clarity on that, in the coverage amounts for unrepresented or which we're talking about later, but dual agency, the claim numbers go up significantly and the payout goes up significantly well. So I caution that this whole thing is about driving costs down. I would urge that it's not just about that. It's about quality representation, which we'll piggyback into this part now, and then we'll wrap up after.
Well, just let me say, of those 20 reports, maybe only half of them are on commissions. The other half are looked at quality issues.
Standard practice.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So, the problem is it's all so complicated, but it's also interrelated. And you have to sort of unpack everything. And what do? You can't deal with everything at once.
Of course. Yeah.
Take a specific point. The point now that we're focused on is the commissions. But I recognize that this is very complicated. It's just, the problem is there has been, in our view, price fixing, and we have to sort of reduce that substantially, ultimately get rid of it. And then we can work on and in fact, that will solve a lot of the problems. I mean, I don't know that you want to get into that now, but I think there's a very strong argument that you can make that if you reduce the commissions, some of the other problems are going to go away.
Potentially, but I think we can both agree, let's not talk specific numbers to consumers any further.
No, we're not going to agree to that. 2% or less.
All right. So let's talk about this one last subject, and then Keith will ask our final question just for time. You mentioned it. So you want to talk about licensing being more difficult, raising the bar, and the sort of glut of agents. So your take on that.
We did 3 reports on this. I think it was July last year, October last year, and January this year. And I'd urge everyone to read those. I think very few people have. And but when they were reported on by the trade press, surprise, most of the comments were very positive about those reports because they recognize, as did the danger report that the industry funded in 2015, that there just is a huge glut of agents. It is mathematically not possible with nearly 2 million agents selling 40 million, even 6 million properties a year. For most of those agents to have a living income. It's not. So the industry is very part-time. And the danger report, I mean, if I had time, I'd read you from the danger report. That's not from CFA.
I've read it.
Yeah, we've read it.
Yeah, anyway, I mean, it's alarmist in terms of talking about and raising questions about the competence of many agents and the frustrations of the full-time, competent, honorable agents that they have working with all those part-timers. So how do you really address that issue? I mean, very briefly, because we're running out of time here. The lower rates are actually going to help because one of the reasons people are drawn to the industry with easy entry is because they're the dream of double ending $1 million sale, $60,000. Well, I mean, that's what drives some of this. And I'm not the only person who's making that argument. And so ironically, that would help. But the main thing is, and you alluded to it, is that we need tougher education requirements. We need different kinds of education requirements that require actual competence to practice brokerage, not just the kind of, well, I can tell you the education, when I took the education course myself, I thought it was a law school course. I mean, it was all about laws and regulations, and I was actually worried I was going to fail the test because my memory isn't what it once was, and I couldn't memorize all the details. But fortunately for me, not so good for the health of the industry. The exam was too easy, and I passed it easily. So you need to toughen up the education requirements, and those reports, especially the second one, gets into that in great detail. Look at that one. Then the exams have to be tougher. If there's one thing that could be done easily in order to restrict entry, it is to toughen the exams. I do believe that the commissions can do that on their own. They don't have to go to state legislatures, and that would do it. They're just, and I know that they've been talking about this because they tell me. Aurelio tells me they're discussing these issues, but nothing's really happening as far as I can tell. And then also, a huge problem in the industry is that there's no adequate mentoring. I mean, there are some agencies, maybe more of the small brokerages. I think one of them, who was it? Was it Remax maybe, had a mentoring program. But there needs to be an industry-wide mentoring program that new licensees are required to participate in, and they really ought to be asked to pay for that because the costs are very low. That's part of the problem. You go into any other profession or trade in financial services, and you're going to need a college degree. You may even need a law degree or a graduate degree. I mean, spending tens of thousands of dollars, maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars, instead of spending what I did, about $500 to get my license. So make them pay, and that will basically discourage all those people who are looking at dollar signs and not wanting to make a full-time commitment, to be a real estate agent because they really believed that this is the career that they've been called to. And so it's a cultural change that has to take place. But if you don't make it tougher to get into the trade, because it really is to an extent a trade now and not a profession, even though almost all the leaders and the industry people, I mean, look, I've talked to hundreds, probably over 1,000 agents and brokers over the years. The large majority of them want to be professionals. They don't want to be part-time salespeople. And so we really share that. And, you'll scoff at this, but I actually see myself as to an extent representing their interests as well as consumer interest.
No, we may not always land at the same answer, but I think you are trying to think about it through the lens of what is best for the consumer and what is best for the industry at the same time.
I'll add, and then we'll get the final question here. Two things, because I actually did some research on this. I wanted to find out some specifics. So I did some back of the hand math on these things. There's over 400,000 licensees in the state of California. Everybody didn't know that's where we are. Um, Background check is $40. License fee is $245. I may be wrong on these numbers, but they're close. Examination fee is $60. How long is it? What is the renewal, Keith? Is it every 4 years? What do you have to do it?
Yeah.
Every 4
You
years.
mean continuing ed?
Yeah, yeah. Well,
Yeah.
to get your license renewed, like how many times do you do that?
Yeah, every 4 years.
Every 4 years.
Yep.
Yeah. So back of the hand math, $150 million. Um, so the other comment was they use it on the jobs report. So that shows people as employed. And part of the issue is the government doesn't want to remove that money. I'm talking specifically state of California, to be clear, Steve. The state doesn't want to lose that money because the state's broke. And at the same time, it shows up on the jobs report. So part of the issue, this is directly from leadership at CER that I spoke to. It's not that they don't want to do it, because ironically, most of the practitioners that volunteer at the associations are actually in the business full time.
Yeah.
I know because I've been doing this a while and I talk to these people, everybody wants to make it more difficult. The states are part of the objection. It is fundamentally comes down to part of the state. In fact, last time CAR went and tried to make it more difficult was 2010. Got both houses to agree to. It was vetoed at the governor's desk. It was Governor Schwarzenegger at the time. So I think there's a lot of complexity there. I think you'll find most people that are in the business full time will agree with that and want to see it more professional, because we all hear about the agents that aren't in it full time, where the one that is doing both sides of the deal and trying to get everything done and making it smoother. So again, some commonality on that. All right, just for times, we got to wrap up.
Let me just respond. You need public visibility on that issue. I am very willing and to work on that issue, bringing in other consumer advocates to support you at the state level. There has to be a really serious commitment, and right now there is not that serious a commitment in most states to do that.
Well, I would state that the thing this is the way Keith and I approach things, which is why we're even all talking. We believe it's better to have everybody in the same room having a conversation about stuff, whether we agree on terms or not, something for Congress to listen to. Whether we all agree on issues or not, it's better to be in the same room having the conversation, because there is a way to find a common path. There is. I just believe there always is. So, I think that this would be, if anybody's listening to this is a time for the industry, instead of fighting every 5 seconds, to figure out how to find some common ground so that there isn't mistakes along the way that end up hurting the consumer further, which doesn't benefit anybody in that perspective. All right.
Get out of the social media chat rooms and get involved and really help the industry, because nothing is being solved in the Facebook groups that I try to stay away from, because
they're dumpster fire.
All right, let's close on this. We asked this question of all of our guests, and since you're a newly minted licensee, I can ask this in the first person of you. Since you're now an agent, if you were to enter into a sales career, what would you implement today to help your business?
Well, I would do the same thing I would urge all agents to do, and that is to just be honest and straightforward with your customers and your clients. It's as simple as that. And I believe that most of the full-time agents and brokers really want to do the right thing. They want to act morally. I think that there are attempts we're both aware of continuing desire to set prices.
Sure.
And I'm getting communications from agents, from brokers, that say, I don't want to do this. I now understand with the new rules that's really not permitted. It violates, if not the letter of the law, the spirit of the law, and they want to do the right thing. And so there's this conflict within the industry that between really the pro-consumer and the anti-consumer, and join the pro-consumer side. Be honest, be honorable. Obey not only obey the rules, but honor the spirit of the settlement, and also, the desire for a truly competitive pro-consumer and pro-professional marketplace.
think it's a good way to end it. Steve, thanks for being here. We appreciate you coming on the show and talking with us. We will genuinely would love to have you back. I'm sure you'll have more controversial stuff you'll throw out, and we'll want to go through some of that. But we do appreciate your time, and again, thanks for being on the pod. So
yeah, and we'll make sure we link to all the reports that we mentioned that you've produced. We'll link those in the show notes, so if people want to read them, which you should want to, you can find them easily. Yeah, thanks a lot, Steve.
Thanks again for the opportunity.
Of course.
Enjoyed the conversation.
Enjoy your new real estate career. Talk soon.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
It's our job to say out loud what everybody's only thinking to themselves. It's your job to subscribe to this podcast so you never miss an episode.